Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And today's topic came about because of our episode on pies. In that episode, we talked about chef Alexis Soyer, who became a very well-known chef both in France and in England, and the many recipes for pies that he included in his cookbooks, and how he was always pretty happy to embrace new methods for cooking if he thought they would benefit his work. He was one of the first chefs to be like, y'all, pie tins, they're great. There was also an incident in his life that I had seen mentioned in one of the articles I used while I was researching pie that made me certain I wanted to learn more about him because it was a wild story. Hard to verify, but it sure is told over and over. So we're going to talk about it and some other things because his life is very fascinating, sometimes wild, often innovative. And we're just going to talk about Alexis Soyer today.
So Alexis Benoit Soyer's early life is very cloudy. As we talk about it, keep in mind that most of what we do know about his youth is not from any records or even from Alexis' own recollections. It's from several friends who published memoirs of Alexis Soyer after his death. It was based on notes from his life and anecdotes that he had told them. So it's like things they heard maybe from him.
Yes.
Maybe. His friend and secretary Francois Volant assembled most of this, although they had a falling out before Soyer's death. And today historians recognize that this memoir includes a lot of tall tales, a lot of inaccuracies. Some of these may have been included out of spite by his friends over disagreements that had come up among them during Soyer's lifetime. I can't fault somebody for, things that happen after they die, but you maybe don't have your frenemies write your memoir.
Well, I don't think he intended to.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. He, he had secretaries that he employed throughout his life, many of whom had been his friends. And so, they were keeping general records of stuff. But yeah, there's a definite shift that happens in the larger part of the 20th century. Any accounts of his life are based on those memoirs. And so there's a propagation of some of those falsehoods. And then things start to shift when more biographers and historians get better access to records and can cross-check things. But there's still some mysteries. So Alexis' birth certificate lists his date of birth as February 4th, 1810, although that biography mentioned above states that it was October of the preceding year. There is some theory that he may not have known his own birthday or he had just picked a different day. He was born in Montbry and his parents were Emery and Madeleine Soyer. And the Soyers were quite poor. They had had a shop earlier in their marriage, a little grocery that did okay for a while, but it failed before Alexis was born. And Emery at that point was earning money as a laborer. Alexis had two older brothers, Philippe, born in 1799, and Louis, born in 1801. Emery and Madeleine had had two other children between Louis and Alexis, but those two babies did not survive.
According to the memoir, Emery and Madeleine had a plan in mind for their youngest son's future, and that was a life in the clergy. But he was so ill-behaved at his school that he got kicked out. We do not know if that is true. And there's also been some speculation that the family may have really been Protestant rather than Catholic or possibly Jewish. That's based on the rarity of the family name and the fact that it matches only with that of Russian Jews that have been identified by historians. The story of the misbehaving choir boy being kicked out of the cathedral was one that Soyer himself told people. So this may have been truth, may have been an invention.
Right. This is also a time we've talked about on this show before when, France, heavily Catholic, that was the societal norm. So that may have been part of why he kind of concocted this story. Alexis' older brother, Philippe, had become a cook. And in 1821, Alexis moved to Paris to learn that trade from him, something neither brother was particularly enthused about. Alexis, who was a kid at this time, wanted to be an actor, not a cook. Philippe had no desire to babysit his rambunctious little brother. But they did manage to work through their initial issues, and when Alexis became an apprentice at the restaurant where Philippe worked in Thiverval-Grignon near Versailles, apparently, once Alexis actually got into the kitchen and focused a little bit, he was really good at cooking. Keep in mind, though, he was still very much a kid. He was only 11 at the time that he moved to Paris, if we are going by that February 1810 birth date.
After a 5-year apprenticeship, Alexis was hired to work in a Paris eatery. It was called Douy, and obviously he was still just a teenager of 16. Soon he was moved up to the position of second cook and then was running the kitchen. There was a staff of 12 under him. He stayed at Douy for 3 years, fine-tuning his abilities. Biographer Ruth Brandon makes a point in her book, The People's Chef, that Soyer found in the structure of a restaurant a stage where he, the chef, could fulfill his dreams of performing. It was just on a different stage than what he had envisioned as a boy. He does seem to have been the perfect match for the still relatively new restaurant scene of Paris. The city's first restaurant, Champ d'Oiseau, had opened in the 1760s, and the idea of Paris as the global epicenter of culinary excellence had quickly been established.
Yeah, he got to, perform in front of guests, essentially perform for his staff. He sort of loved the whole thing. And while he was at Douy, Alexis was trusted with more and more duties, including making catering deliveries. Because he was, by all accounts, very handsome, incredibly charming, and also really outgoing. He would often end up becoming part of whatever party the restaurant had cooked for, as he waited for the dishes to be emptied throughout the event so that he could carry them back to be washed. One such incident allegedly ended with Soyer passing out on the way home. He had had a lot to drink, and waking up without the restaurant's serving tray and without his pants. This led to the young chef being given a nickname in the Paris papers, the enfant terrible of Montmartre.
Soyer seems to have had a really good time throughout the 1820s. He was a popular chef that clients loved to party with, and he clearly enjoyed that life. There's a poem in his memoirs which relays various images of Paris nightlife, and that ends with this stanza, which is translated as, quote, "But hark, in the city the morning bell tolls, and workmen grab coffee and hot buttered rolls. The hammer and tongs have their work to pursue, but I hurry to bed. There's sleeping to do."
When Alexis was 20, he was hired away from Douy by the kitchen of the Prince de Polignac, Jules Armand. Armand was an ultra-royalist, so his story, get ready, is pretty rocky. He was exiled to England during the French Revolution, and he was imprisoned for 9 years when he returned to France, those years of imprisonment being 1804 to 1813, for his participation in a plot to assassinate Napoleon. Once Napoleon abdicated in 1814 and Louis XVIII was restored to the throne, Jules Armand became a peer under the reestablishment of peerage in the Charter of 1814. And Jules Armand raised concerns at that time that the constitutional oath that came with that peerage was disparaging the Catholic Church and the papacy, and as a consequence, it was the Pope who granted him this title of prince.
When Louis XVIII died in 1824, his brother Charles X took the throne of France, and Charles X loved Jules Armand. He had made him an ambassador to England for 6 years, and when the prince returned to Paris in 1829, the king named him prime minister and as head of the French Foreign Office. For Soyer, being hired as assistant to the head chef for such an illustrious figure must have seemed like a really lucrative career move, although it was no secret that the Prince de Polignac was not popular with the people of France. So you can go ahead and prep your sad trombone for this one.
Although it is also kind of funny. Alexis Soyer had been working for the prime minister for a month when Jules Armand and Charles X made some sweeping political moves that were incredibly unpopular. If you know French history, you know what's coming. Remember, Jules Armand believed firmly in the absolute power of the monarchy, and tensions had been steadily rising in the French political sphere since his appointment. On July 26, 1830, he issued 4 incredibly repressive ordinances designed by himself and Charles X to stop the growth of what the two men felt were radical elements in France's elected government. There had been no discussion about these ordinances with the Chamber of Deputies. Charles X believed that he had the right to govern via ordinances as a means to entirely do away with bipartisan bickering. This is, again, a very quick and dirty version of all of the nuances that were going down.
You'll sometimes see these called the July Ordinances or the Four Ordinances of Saint-Cloud because Jules Armand wrote them while at Saint-Cloud. In them, freedom of the press was revoked, the elected legislature, which was the Chamber of Deputies, was dissolved, new elections were announced, and it's changed the rules of how the elections worked. These decrees were exactly as popular as you might expect, and starting the very next day, there were protests, which led to the July Revolution.
These protests instantly impacted Alexis Soyer. His team in the kitchen at the Prince de Polignac's home had been tasked with cooking a massive banquet to celebrate Jules Armand and what he expected was going to be the new era for France. And while Soyer and his team were preparing this feast, a large group of enraged protesters had assembled outside of Polignac's home, and eventually they broke into the house, and specifically they broke into the kitchen. 2 of the kitchen employees were shot.
We've already mentioned the renowned charm that Alexis was said to possess. This served him in this tense situation. He started singing La Marseillaise. According to Alexis' recounting of the event, by the time this was over, the attackers were carrying him on their shoulders out into the streets.
Yeah, somehow he won them over. Made it out alive. His employer did not win over the people. Protests and riots continued for several days, and on August 2nd, Charles X abdicated, Jules Armand was arrested, and Louis-Philippe, the Duc de Chartres, was installed on the throne as Louis-Philippe I. Polignac was imprisoned for several years before being exiled, and Charles was exiled immediately.
We'll talk about the transition in Soyer's life that this episode catalyzed, but first, we will take a quick sponsor break.
Although Alexis Soyer seemed to come through the July Revolution still being everybody's party pal, he also was smart enough to know that he couldn't count on that good fortune forever. He had, after all, taken a job with one of the most hated men in France. So he took off for England. His brother Philippe had already moved there, working for one of King George III's son, Adolphus Guelph, Duke of Cambridge. And just as had been the case when young Alexis moved to Paris, Philippe got his baby brother a job working alongside him. That was before Alexis started bouncing around the finest houses of London, as everyone clamored to hire this fun, handsome French chef.
In 1837, when Alexis was 27, he married an artist from London named Elizabeth Emma Jones, who went by Emma. She was 3 years younger than Alexis, and although she was only in her early 20s, she'd already really made a name for herself. Emma's father had died when she was 4. Her mother hired a variety of teachers to handle her education, including Belgian artist Francois Simneau, who started giving Emma art lessons. Emma was good at just about everything she did, but she was exceptionally talented in drawing. According to an obituary written about her many years later, her artistic talent was so strong that her mother offered her teacher enough money he would stop taking other pupils and focus exclusively on Emma. She really flourished. Her art was exhibited at the Royal Academy when she was still just a child.
The two met when Alexis was looking for a portraitist. His inquiries had led him to seek out Francois Simenon, but the Belgian said that his student could take the job instead. He was kind of just pawning this guy off. Enter Emma. And Alexis was pretty much instantly smitten with her. There is a really quite darling story of their early relationship in that Alexis had sent Emma tulips and received in return a note that she said that he had been extremely forward in doing so. She had not asked him to send a gift, and that the box and the flowers were going to be returned to him the following week. And she did send that box back, but when Alexis opened it, expecting to see dead flowers, what he actually saw was that she had sent him a painting of her tulips.
I love that.
It's the sweetest thing I've ever heard. I love it so much.
The same year that Alexis and Emma were married, Alexis started a job at the newly formed Reform Club of London. The Reform Club, which still exists today, was founded as a private club for Whigs and radicals who supported the Great Reform Act of 1832. So that act, in just the quickest explainer possible, nearly doubled the number of men who were eligible to vote in Britain, and it attempted to address some of the corruption in the way various voting districts were structured. It didn't do a whole lot to help the working class, though, and it had its own problems. That's a different show, though. I think this came up recently, maybe on the gin episode, where we're talking about like class differences and reforms that affected some people but not others. The Reform Club's permanent headquarters at 104 Pall Mall were still under renovation when Alexis was hired to be the chef. So he gave a lot of input to architect Charles Berry to design the kitchen to really best suit his needs.
And that kitchen is still famous. And it was toured almost from the moment of completion by other chefs who wished to copy it. It had a layout that, instead of just kind of being a cramped area, enabled the entire staff to move about in their duties without constantly knocking into each other. And it essentially had every gadget any chef might want, because when Soyer couldn't find something that would suit his needs, he would just invent it. He was incredibly clever. And if you have ever cooked on a gas stove, you can thank Alexis Soyer. The building where the Reform Club was housed had gas lines that had been used for gas lighting for a number of years, and gas had already been used by this point in history for roasting ovens. But Soyer had the gas lines run to the cooktop because he thought it would be beneficial to have greater control over what he was cooking. He also ushered in the transition from just cooking in an oven until whatever you were working on was done to actually having temperature gauges on stoves so that you could set up a more precise food prep and know exactly how long your food was going to take to cook.
I think we can also thank the gas industry for thanking cooking on gas stoves, because they've been a big proponent of doing that. We should also mention we're not talking about one kitchen. We're talking about kitchens, plural, because the cellar of the building where the kitchen we've been describing was didn't only have food prep areas. It also had a cellar, wine storage, rooms for the various staff, rooms for things could be roasted that kept the staff from having to stand in just a broiling kitchen. It was really a marvel. When Queen Victoria had her coronation on June 28th, 1838, Alexis' brand new kitchen turned out breakfast for 2,000 club members in advance of the festivities.
Yeah, that's often pointed to as having been possible because he had set up all of this like very structured, very organized kitchen where he could go, no, it's going to take me 10 minutes to make that, 20 minutes to make that, and he could balance the whole thing perfectly. Although Alexis was really having a banner time at this point in his life, he had this new job that was great. He had a kitchen of his dreams. He and Emma were deeply in love. There were some tragedies ahead. His brother, Philippe Soyer, died of consumption in 1840. And 2 years later, his beloved Emma died suddenly. She was pregnant at the time, and the baby was also lost. The story of this is a little uncertain. The lore is that there was a particularly intense thunderstorm the night of September 1st, 1842, and it had frightened her to the point that she went into early labor and that something went wrong. We don't actually know what caused her death. There are certainly a lot of late-term complications. She was almost at her due date, but we don't know. Alexis, to make matters worse, was away at the time in Brussels. He thought he had time to make this trip and get back before the baby came. And he is described as having gone into shock when he heard the news.
Alexis chose to honor his wife's memory through charity. Several years after her death, he staged an exhibition called Swayze's Philanthropic Gallery. This was filled with Emma's work. Soyer had made a habit of purchasing any of Emma's works when they went up for sale, so he would show them to people and talk about her and her talent at every opportunity. The philanthropy of the project was how the gallery profits were to be spent, which was setting up a soup kitchen for the poor of London. The project didn't make enough money to actually get that off the ground, though.
No, but he did really innovate in that area, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. After Emma, though, Alexis did find love again. Francesca Teresa Giuseppa Raffaella Cerrito, known more commonly by the name Fanny Cerrito, was an Italian ballerina who had trained with Salvatore Taglioni. and was the principal ballerina at La Scala from 1838 to 1840. From 1840 to 1848, she was contracted to dance at Her Majesty's Theatre in London, and in 1844, she met Alexis Soyer. The two of them were quite taken with one another, although Alexis was not the only man who was vying for Fanny's affections. And though Soyer is famous for his cookbooks, his first published work was a ballet scene titled La Fille de l'Orange, and that was very obviously about Fanny. He also created a rather famous dessert for her with a little mini version of his love dancing atop it in confection.
Alexis' major rival when it came to Fanny's heart was Arthur Saint-Leon, a dancer who was her leading man. She chose the dancer when it came to marriage, although their relationship was rocky and they separated. It appears that Fanny and Alexis may have rekindled their relationship, and it might have continued off and on for the rest of his life.
There are some pretty good hints in there. There are various doings where they're in the same places and whatnot, but we don't have anything concrete to prove it. So while he was serving some of the wealthiest people in Britain at the Reform Club, Soyer had also developed a very keen sense of duty for feeding the needy, both in London and elsewhere. We have talked on the show before about the Great Hunger, the Irish potato famine. While Alexis Soyer may not have been aware of all the politics that had contributed to the severity of the situation, he saw hungry people and he felt compelled to help. After gaining attention by writing letters to various news outlets about this issue, British Prime Minister John Russell sent Soyer to Ireland with an invitation from the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, John Ponsonby, 4th Earl of Bessborough.
Once he got to Ireland and assessed the situation, thanks to a leave of absence from his job at the Reform Club, Soyer decided to set up a soup kitchen and to help get some nutrition to Ireland's starving population. This is often described as the first proper soup kitchen, not just a place where people gave away leftover food, but an actual functioning kitchen where fresh food was prepared specifically for feeding the poor.
He had concocted recipes for the soup kitchen before he left London, and he had tested his recipes on his wealthy and high-placed friends of England, making it clear that he thought everyone should have food that pleased the palate, no matter their situation. One of his recipes for famine soup includes drippings and a pound of cubed beef sautéed with 2 sliced onions, and then turnips, celery leaves, and leeks are added, and that's all sautéed a bit together. And then he adds flour, pearl barley, salt, and a little brown sugar, and water, and he lets the whole thing simmer for several hours. He carefully worked out the cost of making this soup to ensure that he could, in fact, feed as many people as possible, as healthfully as he possibly could, for as little money as possible. His goal had been to feed 5,000 people a day from this food counter, but the actual reported number was closer to 8,750 on the busiest days. He set up additional kitchens around Ireland, and once he had everything up and running, he handed off the management of those soup kitchens to local charity workers and returned to his job in London in 1849.
That recipe sounds a lot tastier than a lot of the recipes that we talked about in our episode on home economics and like the the brochures and things that the government was putting out in the US during the Great Depression to like encourage people to eat cheaper foods.
Yeah.
This actually sounds pretty tasty, and those sounded more like boil some cabbage a lot of the times.
Yeah.
Eat your boiled cabbage. If you like boiled cabbage, that's fine.
The boiled cabbage people are coming for you, Tracy.
They are. So seeing that additional fundings was needed for such projects, Alexis used his fame as a chef to drum up some of that funding. While he was still in Ireland, he wrote and published a charity cookbook that was titled simply Charitable Cookery. It was written entirely so that all proceeds went to groups that aided the poor. The book's first printing of 10,000 sold out so quickly that another 100,000 were printed. Those were all sold within 4 months. After that, new editions were printed as needed for the next 20 years.
I have in my head this vision that the rich patrons of the Reform Club were a lot of the people buying these books, and they probably never cooked from them. But it doesn't matter because the money went to good places. We are going to talk about another transition in Alexis Soyer's life in just a moment, but first we will hear from the sponsors that keep Stuff You Missed in History class going. In 1850, there was a shakeup at the Reform Club. The decision was made by leadership that non-members could access the coffee room, and Alexis Soyer was incensed. So incensed that he quit. This was not the first time that he quit, but the head of the club, Lord Marcus Hill, had never accepted his resignation before. This time, the resignation was accepted, so if Alexis had been bluffing to try to get his way, it backfired. But that is only one version of this story.
The coffee room was opened. It was really the dining room, and the decision had been made that 2 days a week at lunch, the public could come in for a meal. This may well have affronted Soyer. His very posh, private dining experience was being turned into basically just a restaurant. But the truth was, he had been at the Reform Club for 13 years. During that time, he'd had a variety of clashes and reconciliations with leadership, and really, it seems like after his trip to Ireland, he realized he wanted something different than his old job. By all accounts, he remained on great terms with Lord Marcus Hill and the other members of the club's leadership committee.
Yeah, there were various problems. Some patrons didn't like that he acted like their equal and not like help, and there were complaints about that. He really did not care for social structure very much at all. But also, like, he just didn't put up with people being jerks, and he would tell them off and didn't care how powerful or rich they were. So, not everyone can stay in service forever. By this point, though, his notoriety as a chef and his charitable works, his kitchen design, and his inventions had given Alexis Soyer the leverage of pretty broad name recognition. So he signed a deal with the Cross and Blackwell Food Company to produce a Soyer branded line of products. These were things like sauces and relishes, and the business deal really benefited the food company more than Soyer. But that doesn't seem to have been a particularly big issue for the chef. He had done quite well for himself financially. He got paid very well in the 13 years that he worked at the Reform Club. He didn't really ever seem to worry about finances once he had become established as a chef. He wasn't especially preoccupied with money unless it was figuring out ways to finance food programs for public assistance. And we should point out that's because he was sitting in a place of privilege where he wasn't worried about where money was coming from.
Soyer also capitalized on the London exhibition of 1851 by opening a restaurant across from Hyde Park called Swayze Universal Symposium to All Nations. This is where he once again invented something we probably think of as a 20th century novelty, and that's a restaurant where every room has a different theme. The themes were all based on categories from the expo, and Alexis developed a menu with dishes that almost anyone could afford, as well as pricier fare for the more well-to-do diners. This all sounds kind of amazing, but it was a flop. The restaurant had been really expensive to build, decorate, and staff, and then after 3 months, he had to close the doors for good.
Yeah, he really thought people were going to come out of the expo, be all excited about things, and then want to eat food related to the stuff they had just seen, which I 100% am his customer base, but apparently not everyone was. And although the restaurant closed its books with an estimated debt of £7,000, this is the very roughest of conversions, but after looking at several different ones, I came up with that being roughly equivalent to about $750,000 today. But Soyer still had income. His books and his branded foods had kept money coming in, and he also started working as a consultant during this time for events where large-scale banquets were needed. He only took jobs like that if the organizers of such events agreed that all leftover food should be given to the poor rather than go to waste.
In 1851, Alexis discovered that he had family he had not known about in the form of a son. Jean-Alexis Lemain wrote to Soyer and told him that he was the child of a woman named Adelaide Lemain, who Alexis had a romance with before leaving France for England. Soyer did not question this young man's word and accepted him as his son. He visited Paris 2 years later and gave Jean-Alexis all of the legal rights of an heir. Lemain changed his last name to Soyer. There's some evidence that Soyer had always known that he had a son. The timing of his exit from Paris suggests that Jean-Alexis would have been born before the chef left for London.
Yeah, that's one of those, it seems sort of mysterious, but then people are always like, he never once was like, I don't think I have a son. Are you sure? He was like, oh yeah, that sounds right. So it seems like he might have known. The Crimean War began in 1853, and that was, of course, a conflict with the Russian Empire on one side and the united forces of Britain, France, Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire on the other. This is another one that's hard to parse quickly in a small paragraph about someone's life, but there were multiple causes, including religion, Russian expansion, and the occupation of Ottoman territories as that dynasty declined. All of the combatants had their own various reasons and motivations for participating. This is a huge topic well outside the scope of this episode. What is germane to Alexis Soyer's story is that thousands of British troops had been sent to the Black Sea to fight, and thousands of them landed in hospitals that were understaffed and had woefully inadequate supplies. The British hospital at Scutari had been the location where Florence Nightingale and her cadre of nurses had gone at the end of 1854 to try to improve conditions and medical treatment there. But the situation they found was horrifying and dire. There were rodent and insect infestations, and patients were sometimes sitting on stretchers for days with no one to look after them.
As news of these horrific conditions were reported in the papers, Alexis Soyer read about the problems of the hospital, and he had the same desire that had led to his time in Ireland. In early February 1855, he wrote a letter to the Times offering his services. It read, quote, "To the editor of the Times. Sir, after carefully perusing the letter of your correspondent dated Scutari in your impression of Wednesday last, I perceive that, although the kitchen under the superintendence of Miss Nightingale affords so much relief, the system of management at the large one in the Barrack Hospital is far from being perfect. I propose offering my services gratuitously and proceeding directly to Scutari at my own personal expense to regulate that important department. If the government will honor me with their confidence and grant me the full power of acting according to my knowledge and experience in such matters, I have the honor to remain, sir, your obedient servant, A. Soyer, February 2nd, 1855.
And soon, with the help of influential and wealthy friends, Alexei had gained permission and authority to do as he asked, to travel to Crimea and do whatever he felt necessary to improve the hospital kitchens and the nutritional care of British and French troops. When he arrived, it was apparent to him almost instantly that they could cut back on illness simply by having good food that was properly prepared, because some of the soldiers were falling ill without ever having been in combat just due to malnutrition.
Reports of Soyer's efforts in Crimea describe him in a number of fascinating ways. One ambassador's wife wrote to Queen Victoria that the chef, quote, has done much good in the kitchens. He is a most ridiculous man, but quite perfect in his way. He was well liked by the people he worked with in Crimea, and he and Florence Nightingale collaborated as they traveled from hospital to hospital, assessing each one and improving things in whatever way they could manage.
Soyer was, we should mention, and we kind of referenced this earlier, an inventor, and that was part of what made him able to set up kitchens in places that began essentially with nothing. Throughout his work, he had done things like cook on a little mini stove that was powered by gas. It was something he called a magic stove. And he had been working on an apparatus that would come to be known as the Soyer field stove, which existed for a very long time. This was a portable stove that was comprised of what looks like a large metal drum that sat atop a burner, and on top of it, you could place a large cauldron to cook food in mass quantities. This stove was incredibly durable. You could use it indoors or out, and it would work even in inclement weather.
Soyer had intended to bring some of his stoves with him, and he did bring some, but only 10. That was far short of the 400 he had hoped would be ready when he left London, but he made do. In some locations, he had to design and build structures that could house cooking spaces and keep the supplies safe from the elements. He arranged that each regiment had a trained cook, not one of the men on cooking duty, but someone whose sole responsibility was feeding everyone. He also invented 2 different types of field rations that could keep for longer than standard rations and were more nutritionally balanced than what the soldiers had been getting. One was a dried and seasoned vegetable cake, and the other was a biscuit made using pea flour that he said could be, quote, soaked in tea, coffee, or soup.
And according to some accounts, including those of famous figure Mary Seacole, the British-Jamaican proprietor of the so-called British Hotel of the Crimean War, Alexis Soyer retained that part of himself that had always been the convivial life of the party. Though Seacole was associated in the writings of Florence Nightingale with kindness, as well as, quote, drunkenness and improper conduct, her business, which Seacole described as, quote, a mess table and comfortable quarters for sick and convalescent officers, was kind of the perfect place for Soyer to find some respite in what was surely a stressful and harrowing trip. Seacole called Alexis, quote, the great high priest in the mysteries of cookery, and described him as good-natured and always a source of fun.
Yeah, I think if you're going to think about Florence Nightingale's writing about anyone who was not white,
you're going to get some.
You need to take into consideration that she had some racist views. Soyer came down with a bacterial infection, which was debilitating during this. He spent weeks in bed. He never fully recovered, but he did return to the various camps where his stoves had been delivered to make sure the cooks knew how to set them up and use them. He almost certainly pushed himself too hard, including serving dinner parties where he could. When the war ended in 1856, he, of course, wanted to serve up a huge party. After a stop in Constantinople, Soyer finally returned to London in the late spring of 1857.
But though he tried to basically go back to his usual lifestyle after returning home, Soyer was clearly weakened by his illness, and he continued to decline. He just never got better. He died on August 5th, 1858, and he was buried next to his wife. He left the artwork of Emma's that he had collected over the years to the National Gallery, and a portrait that she made of him is still on display at the Reform Club.
I'm glad you did this one.
Me too.
Not somebody I knew about at all. Do you have listener mail?
I do, and since we are talking about someone who made his living making food, I thought we would have a food-related listener mail. This is from our listener, Rob, who says, I was tempted to write in based on the pie episode, but I didn't think my comments were pie-related enough, but the minisode put me over the top. I have a signature dessert that is less a pie than a pumpkin pie-inspired dump cake. I learned it as something called the Great Pie Dessert. I started calling it upside-down pumpkin pie, and after I started sharing with some friends on Broadway, it was renamed Pumpkin Crack. The name is how it has been known by at least 4 different shows as people have moved from production to production. Before the shutdown, one show almost had a standing order for it. Sadly, COVID protocols means that they cannot accept homemade goods at the stage door, or shows that do require they be individually wrapped. That is beyond my talent level. Anyway, attached is the recipe with my modifications and also a picture I got with Tracy when I recognized her at the off-Broadway production of Puffs while you were both in town for New York Comic Con. Thank you for the great content.
So good.
Also, he writes, 2 Christmases ago, my sister and I updated our family cookbook. Next time I go visit, I will grab 2 to send you folks. It is clearly my family's cookbook as our chapters do not follow the progressions of a meal like many do. Instead, we start with the important recipes and have chapters for cakes, cookies, puddings, and candy, and pies. Rob, this is amazing. For our listeners, I will also, just as I did back when we got the amazing meatloaf recipe, I will ask if he's okay with us sharing this on like our social channels.
Cool.
Because I'm making it. I haven't made it yet, but this is going to be perhaps my downfall. I don't know. We'll see. It sounds amazing, and I can see why people want it all the time. So thank you for answering my call of people to send us recipes for delicious things. And it seemed like exactly the right thing to discuss while we were discussing Alexis Soyer, who loved sharing food with people. If you would like to write to us, you can do so at historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com, and you can find us on social media, where hopefully with Rob's permission, we will share that recipe. And if you have not yet subscribed to the show, you can do that on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.